friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lauren. You may also call me Lo, and today I'm bringing you some nonfiction recommendations. So if you've been following me since the beginning of my booktube journey, I started my channel in January and I haven't read much nonfiction since I started. I think I've read one memoir. However, I used to read a lot of nonfiction books and I'm hoping to start reading more nonfiction books, but I thought it would be fun to talk about some of the books that I read before booktube that I really enjoyed. Generally, I tend to enjoy nonfiction books about social sciences and social issues, but you'll see my recommendations kind of span across a lot of topics. All of which were interesting to me. Generally, I'll read any nonfiction about a topic that interests me. My first recommendation is Quiet by Susan Cain. This is a book about introversion and introverts. So Susan Cain takes us through kind of the history of what she calls the extrovert ideal in our society and kind of argues that introverts are very undervalued in our society. And she kind of explains the power that introverts have and kind of the contributions that introverts make to our society and what our society would look like without introverts. She basically just lifts introversion up and explains why introverts are valuable and kind of flips the extrovert ideal on its head. This book is extremely well researched. And I'd recommend it honestly to every introvert, but also kind of to everyone, because I think if you have an introvert in your life, if your partner, spouse, child, whatever is an introvert, this really helps you understand them. And this book really helped me understand myself and kind of helped me gain a certain sense of confidence around being an introvert, because the extrovert ideal is real. Like, we really value extroversion, and when you don't fit into that box, it can feel like, I don't know, bad. So this book was really helpful. It also includes some tips for introverts. It goes through like famous introverts from history who made a big difference in the world. I really enjoyed this book. I would recommend it to pretty much everyone, unless you're an extrovert surrounded by extroverts, which is unlikely. So I recommend picking this one up. I really enjoyed it, and I will always have a copy of this on my bookshelf because I return to it all the time. My next recommendation is Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Matthew Desmond is a kind of well-respected sociologist, and this book follows 8 families in Milwaukee who are all kind of struggling to keep their housing and to stay housed. Through the stories of these 8 families you become very attached to, Desmond kind of explains poverty and economic exploitation in a very powerful way. He also offers a lot of tangible, researched solutions to housing insecurity and ultimately homelessness. And I think it's just a very powerful book. I think the biggest strength of this book is that Desmond uses these true stories of these real families to kind of put a face to this issue and to make the issue feel a lot closer to home if it's an issue that hasn't affected you personally. And I just really appreciated this book. Sean read this recently and also really enjoyed it. Generally, I think if the issue of homelessness and housing insecurity is something that you're curious about, curious is probably not the right word, concerned about, this is a book that I would definitely recommend picking up. This book came out quite a while ago, but I think that everything it discusses is still very pertinent and relevant. My next recommendation is Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. So Bryan Stevenson is a lawyer, and this book kind of goes through his early career as a law student and then his process of creating this law office called the Equal Justice Initiative that primarily serves people who are wrongly incarcerated. And this book also discusses in detail the first kind of client of the Equal Justice Initiative, whose name is Walter McMillan. And Walter McMillan is a Black man who was sentenced to death for the murder of a white woman, which he did not commit. And through the story of Walter, Bryan Stevenson kind of explains how our criminal justice system fails a lot of people and kind of discusses mass incarceration of Black men and kind of explains how that, in conjunction with the death penalty, has kind of resulted in this institutionalized lynching that we have in this country. It's an extremely powerful book. I would recommend this to pretty much everybody. If the issue of mass incarceration is something that you want to learn more about, I definitely would recommend this one. Definitely on the heavier side, but definitely a very illuminating and enlightening book to read. The next book that I'm going to recommend is the smallest and cutest book on my bookshelf, and that is We Should All Be Feminists by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. The reason that this book is so tiny is because it's an essay. Adichie did a TED Talk where she talked about kind of her opinions on feminism and feminism in the 21st century, and it kind of went viral, and then she published this essay where she kind of talks about the same topics. In this essay, she defines feminism for the 21st century and kind of roots her definition in inclusion, and also makes a very compelling argument for why discrimination against women not only disadvantages women, but also disadvantages men. And she also uses experiences from her past to illustrate all of her points. And she describes experiences that occurred both in the US and in Nigeria. And it's just a very, very kind of inspiring book. I think it's a very well written and well argued essay. And I would also recommend this to pretty much everybody. Next, I have a book that I'd probably put in like the comedy area of nonfiction, but it's also memoir. So this is Let's Pretend This Never Happened by Jenny Lawson. This book is it's a memoir. So Jenny Lawson takes us through kind of her bizarre upbringing in rural Texas and her high school years, as well as kind of her relationship with her husband. And all of her stories are kind of centered around the idea that kind of life's most embarrassing moments, the moments that you wish you could pretend never happened, are kind of the most defining moments in your life. At least this is kind of what Lawson is arguing in this book. And this book is just hysterical. Like, this book will make you laugh out loud. I think this is the funniest book I've ever read. And for that reason, I would definitely recommend it. But this one's more of a lighthearted book for sure. I was reading this on a plane and couldn't stop laughing and had to stop reading it because I didn't want to just be laughing hysterically while reading a book in front of all these people that I didn't know. So definitely recommend this one highly if you want something just kind of funny and lighthearted. My next two recommendations and my last two recommendations are kind of in the area of public health. This is something I haven't talked about on my channel yet, but I am a public health professional and I enjoy reading books about public health. And I've chosen two to put on this list, mostly because a lot of them I feel like are pretty inaccessible or even like not interesting to people who aren't in my field. But these two I think are like more broadly interesting to people who just like want to learn about public health or want to like read something about public health issues. The first one's more public health heavy and the second one I think is more generalizable. But anyway, my next recommendation is Mountains Beyond Mountains by Tracy Kidder. This book is an autobiography of Dr. Paul Farmer, who is probably one of the most famous and influential figures in public health. He did a lot of work in infectious disease, and he kind of brought interventions and also kind of the infrastructure necessary to perform these interventions to places and countries that didn't have it prior. I think most of his work, I can't remember like the super specifics, but I think most of his work was surrounding tuberculosis and HIV, and some countries that I remember that he worked in were like Haiti, Peru, and Russia. But I think that what's really fascinating about this book, in addition to Paul Farmer just being a very, very interesting, inspiring person, is that this is a biography, not an autobiography. And I think Tracy Kidder did a really good job of portraying Paul Farmer as both this very inspiring person, but also this very kind of imperfect person. I think in a lot of ways, Paul Farmer gave up everything in his life to become the person that he was and become the figure that he was, because for him, like, making a difference was the meaning of his life. So I think that while he's like this awesome, amazing person, Tracy Kidder really made him a real person with real kind of flaws, and I really, really appreciated that aspect of this book. Unfortunately, Paul Farmer passed away this year, but he remains, I think, one of the most influential public health figures in our history. Finally, my last recommendation is such a good book, and it is The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. This book takes place kind of around World War I when radium, the element, was discovered. And when radium was discovered, it was a very popular thing, and beauty products, medical products, all sorts of products had radium in them because people thought it was like this miracle cure, and people thought that it was beautiful because it glowed. And the book follows this group of teenage girls who were hired by a factory that made watch dials, and they would paint the numbers on the watch dials in radium so that it glowed in the dark. And at the time, this was like a very, very prestigious, kind of respectable job, and everyone wanted this job because these girls would walk out of the factory and they'd be covered in radium and they'd be shining. And at the time, it was like a very precious, very expensive substance. The book follows these girls as they're working and slowly become ill. And these girls kind of find themselves in the midst of this pretty significant controversy around the dangers of radium and this kind of new workers' rights movement. So that is it for my nonfiction recommendations. I decided to kind of go over the best of the best, so I know there weren't a lot on this list, but I definitely highly recommend all of them. If you have any nonfiction recommendations for me, let me know. I'd love for you to leave them in a comment down below. If you're still here, thank you so much for being here. I always really appreciate it, and I will see you next time.